That's right, I know it's been a while, but the scouting reports are back. I told you they would be, so enjoy. I'm moving on now to the top names in this year's wide receiver class. Hip hip hooray. And I'm kicking things off by talking about who many perceive to be the number one wide receiver in the 2018 NFL draft class. That is Calvin Ridley from the national champions, the Alabama Crimson Tide. Roll Tide and all that garbage. They ain't rolling into class. They're doing it right. At least they're cheating and winning. Anyways, off of that soapbox, let's talk about this prospect. And let's talk about Calvin Ridley and whether or not he really is, for my money, the number one wide receiver in this year's draft. I can't lie. A lot of times when I go in and I hear about these guys being the number one rated, or they're this, or they're that, I always tend to be skeptical because we see it so often year after year after year where so many of these guys are talked about their top 5, their top 10 type of talents, and then as people do their homework on them, the reality is quite different. But I look at Calvin Ridley, and I can see what all the fuss was about. Granted, he's not the biggest guy in the world, but he's a guy with really, really good burst, initial quickness, speed. He's got plenty of athleticism for sure, and in particular, his burst, his acceleration, his overall quickness is really top-notch stuff. He's a guy that can get in and out of breaks very quickly. He is a guy that can get up to top speed very quickly. He's a guy that can be an explosive playmaker, even though his vertical speed is really decent. And you saw that in the 40 at the Combine. It's decent. It's not spectacular. It's not exceptional. But if you're really, really quick, you don't have to have the best pure vertical speed to get open and be a vertical threat. And I do feel like Calvin Ridley can be a very effective vertical threat at the National Football League level and a threat in a variety of different roles. He's a guy that his route running is absolutely top-notch stuff. Like if you're getting a guy out of college, you want him as refined, as polished, as well-finished as a route runner as Calvin Ridley is. Like I said, really, really top-notch stuff. And his ability to separate, especially in off-man and kind of shadow coverage, is outstanding. He could struggle a little bit against the press, but frankly, a lot of college wide receivers that aren't 6'5", 200 pounds, 220 pounds can struggle against the press, and even some of those guys still happen to struggle against the press. Also, what I love about Calvin Ridley is his ability to run after the catch. He is a guy that is as much of a home run threat once the ball is in his hands as anything else. I mean, he can make people miss. He runs hard. He runs physically. He can run through tackles. He's a guy that you look at and you say, who's your number one targeter? Who's your trusted weapon? In late game situations, third and long, you gotta have it type of plays. He's the guy that you could throw it to 2 or 3 yards short of the first down marker, and you're confident that he has the athletic ability and the baller mentality to be able to go get those extra yards, lower his head, make people miss, and get the first down. And you got to love that. And it's one of those traits you would look at out of a number one NFL wide receiver is, does that dude have that it factor? Can he make those big plays when your team really needs him? It's not always just purely about the numbers and the big plays. It's about those plays that matter the most, those plays that can make all the difference in a game. Can they do them? And Calvin Ridley can. I also liked how Calvin Ridley was able to be productive in the midst of, really frankly, some shoddy quarterback play at Alabama. Let's just call it as we see it. A system that wasn't designed to really showcase him, that limited his opportunities. He made the most of it. There's no question about it. And if he had played in a more quarterback-friendly, more receiver-friendly, more passing game-friendly system, and a more passing game-friendly conference, you'd be talking about a guy that'd probably be putting up 1,300, 1,400 yards in a college season. He was that good as a route runner, that good after the catch. So I get it. Now, my concerns for him at his size, is he really truly going to be a number one type of guy? Just because you're not 6'4" doesn't mean you're automatically limited to the slot or limited to being a number 2, but teams prefer a 6'3", 6'4" number one wide receiver. Some teams might say he's not a number one. I think other teams will look at him and say he's just fine. I worry a little bit that he's not the cleanest catcher of the football. His hands need some work. With as good of a route runner as he is, you would expect him to be able to execute as something as fundamentally important as catching the football, and at times his hands just aren't great. Some of it, I think, is the technique of how he tries to catch the football. Some of it is focus and concentration, but he's got to clean that stuff up a little bit. He's also going to have to get better, as I alluded to a little bit earlier, beating press coverage. But again, that's something a lot of guys got to be able to do. And sometimes, especially if you're going to play Ridley a lot out of the slot, which you envision teams would in the NFL, it might not be as important to beat that press coverage because you might be able to get favorable matchups and they're not going to be able to get to you quick enough to be able to stick you. So you're going to be able to shake the hell out of them. Also similar to Amari Cooper coming out of Alabama a few years ago. Not the most explosive in terms of the catch radius, going up and getting the 50-50 balls, being able to adjust his body, making those big-time spectacular catches. He does not have the biggest catch radius. I mean, he's not a huge dude, but his catch radius is only average. So it could put a little more pressure at times on the quarterback to have to be a little more precise and trying to get it into a smaller throwing window, a smaller target zone, where other guys, like I said, 6'4", 6'5", you can kind of throw it up. You don't have to be as accurate. You trust the receiver to be able to adjust and make the play. And that's not something you're really going to fully have with Calvin Ridley. One big concern you're going to hear a lot about is the fact that he's going to be 24 years old as a rookie. That's kind of old, especially when you're talking about taking a guy in the top 10, top 15. That's old. There's no way to spin that. You're wondering what the hell happened in life that this dude only spent 3 years at Alabama and he's going into the NFL and he'll already be 24 years of damn age. You'll wonder. And some teams might back off of him a little bit in terms of their grading because of the fact that he is a bit aged as a prospect. When you're thinking about a team saying, hey, we want to invest a top 10 or 15 pick in a guy, you'd rather do it when they're 21, maybe 22 years of age, whereas they're 24, they get 4 years through the rookie deal, you're already talking about 27, 28 years of age. Now, one more deal, they're already in their early 30s, and you're already looking to move on from them, whereas at least when they're 21, you're talking about 4 to 5 years, you're giving them a big deal at 25, 26, then in 3 or 4 years, you're talking about 28, 29, you're potentially giving them another big deal, and then you're thinking of moving on from them at 31, 32. You get more time, you get more out of that pick in terms of potential return on the investment. So it makes sense why there's going to be a concern. But I don't think it should be such an overwhelming concern that teams looking for wide receiver help in this draft should steer clear of him. I think that's kind of ridiculous. Now, overall, his combination of athleticism and route running really is outstanding. Like I said, it is top-notch type of stuff. He's a guy that I can envision right away being able to get into an NFL offense, and once he picks up that NFL offense, will be able to survive and do just fine. I don't look at him and see a ton of bust factor. He might not have the biggest ceiling. You know, the ceiling is the roof. He might have the highest pure ceiling out of the wide receivers in this class, but his floor, I think, is higher than anybody else's. Because absolute worst case scenario, even though he's not the biggest guy, even though he's not the most physical guy, worst case scenario, he becomes a Pro Bowl level slot receiver. And in today's NFL, that means as much, if not more, than guys that are playing on the outside. It really does. And a lot of teams are sitting there taking their guys, whether they're 5'9" or 6'5", and sticking them in this damn slot. So he could have a really good career there, just in and of itself. Like I said, age is going to be a factor for some teams, but I don't know how big of a deal it should be, because even when you're talking about these teams that take a guy at, let's say, 21, 22 years of age, yeah, you get him through the rookie deal, they're 25, 26, something like that. But a lot of these teams, by the time the guy turns 28, 29, 30, they're already thinking about moving on and going to the next generation of players at the position. Many times those are the guys that after spending 8, 9, 10 years with the team, they get released due to salary cap reasons. So how much does it really matter? And especially if you're a team that's either in the playoff mix or thinking about being close to the playoff mix, a guy like Calvin Ridley, yes, 24, pretty young 24 from a football standpoint. You talk about a guy that can come in and potentially make an impact right away. You're talking about a guy that you can still get several years of quality football out of, and you don't have to do a ton of work to get it out of them and wait 2 or 3 years for it. To me, there would be an appeal for a guy like a Calvin Ridley. Once you get to like Baltimore's pick in 16 and on, the Cowboys at number 19, the Panthers at 24, that would be kind of his range. I would feel like that Calvin Ridley goes in this draft. I understand some teams might not be as huge on him because of size, because of age, but I look at him and I'm like, man, you got to feel confident or comfortable that he's going to be at least a pretty solid number 2 or a slot weapon. You know, like Amari Cooper, I think sometimes gets pumped a little too full of smoke and he's a little overrated, but he's a pretty good number 2 wide receiver. He's a pretty good number 2 wide receiver. And if Calvin Ridley becomes Amari Cooper in the NFL, you got to feel pretty good about that pick, especially because the Raiders once had to spend the 4th overall pick in 2015 on a guy like Amari Cooper. For Calvin Ridley, you're talking about somewhere, like I said, between maybe pick 16 to 24. Maybe a little earlier, maybe a little after, but not much earlier or later than that. And I feel like, again, he's arguably the most NFL ready right now. He's the safest choice at the position. And when I look at him, I do agree at this moment that he is the top wide receiver prospect in this draft. My NFL comparison for him, the easy comparison that a lot of people may make will be Amari Cooper. And I get it. Same program, similar profile. When I watch Calvin Ridley on film, I see a little bit more Antonio Brown. I see a guy that could be even more dangerous, even more explosive, potentially out of the slot. You can move around and do all types of things with. I think Calvin Ridley has more upside than Amari Cooper. I do. And when I watch him, I see flashes of Antonio Brown. And before everybody just automatically dismisses that and thinks that's crazy, well, how many of you thought Antonio Brown coming out of college was going to be a future All-Pro? He was taken in the 6th round of the draft for a reason, and sometimes you just can't project these things. So when we make some of these comparisons, sometimes we talk about, oh my God, how dare you compare him to such and such and such and such. Well, if I had sat there and compared an Antonio Brown coming out of college to some superstar wide receiver, people would have thought I was insane too. And look at him now. He is a superstar wide receiver. That is one of the prototypes for the wide receiver position in the league, and people are looking for that type of guy that can have that type of impact, maybe without some of the foolishness that he does from time to time. My final grade on Calvin Ridley is a 91.5. If I'm a team, like I said, at any point in time after drafting about 16 or so, I feel really, really good about taking a Calvin Ridley if I have a need at wide receiver, because I'm either a playoff team that just got somebody that can contribute right away, or I'm a team that's thinking about being in the playoffs in 2018. I've now gotten a guy that could potentially go out there and make an impact right away. That's where I think about the Ravens, even with some of the moves they've made at wide receiver. Calvin Ridley could be a day one impact guy for them. The Dallas Cowboys, most certainly, he could be another day one impact guy. The Carolina Panthers, I'd be stunned if all three of those teams, had the opportunity to draft Calvin Ridley and ultimately did not. And I feel like it would be kind of foolish and one of those things that they would come to regret for years to come.